Thanks for joining me here for the Daily Bread Bible Study. This is day 245 for Tuesday, September 1st, 2020, focusing on Ezekiel chapters 28 through 30. Now, I forgot to mention last time Ezekiel chapter 27, so I'll briefly overview it as such. Now, chapter 27 has the lament of Tyre. In verse 4, your borders are in the heart of the seas, your builders made perfect your beauty. As I referenced a little last time, the writer is very favorable of Tyre as a beautiful city, as a place of trade and all sorts of popularity and commerce happening in its area. It proceeds then to name the ways in which every nation around traded with Tyre, and then ultimately talks about its downfall in verse 33 of chapter 27. When your waves came from the seas, you satisfied many peoples. With your abundant wealth and merchandise, you enriched the kings of the earth. Now you are wrecked by the seas, in the depths of the waters. Your merchandise and all your crew have sunk with you. So Tyre rose and fall, and in chapter 28, we get into the word of the Lord came to me, mortal, saying to the prince of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am a god, and I sit on the seat of the gods, in the heart of the seas. Yet you are but a mortal, and no god, though you compare your mind with the mind of a god. So, what does it mean to compare their mind with the mind of a god? Well, in verse 5, by your great wisdom and trade you have increased your wealth, and your heart has become proud in your wealth. And so all of this wisdom, this pride, kind of leads to their own downfall. In verse 12 it says, mortal, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, thus says the Lord God, you were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Skipping to verse 15, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until iniquity was found in you. And the iniquity was this, in the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence, and you sinned. And so I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and the guardian cherub drove you out from among the stones of fire. So Tyre got greedy. The wealth that they had, the influence, the commerce, everything got to their head, and they became very proud and absorbed in their own ways, so much to the detriment of the least of these. They sinned by using force to influence trade. In verse 17, your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor, which sounds sounds a lot like changing your message and trying to take your message and just adapt it in ways that benefit you, instead of thinking about what's fair and just and right. And so this sense of corruption sticks with them too, so I imagine that is why there is some hesitation and some willingness to speak against Tyre here in the book of Ezekiel. Continuing on in chapter 28, in a place often associated with Tyre, we hear the Sidon is prophesied against. Now, violence and destruction are in store for Sidon there along the coast with Tyre. Now, all of this hardship will give way to blessings and knowledge of God's activity in their lives. In verse 25, they shall settle on their own soil, and I will give that I gave to my servant Jacob. And this is to Jerusalem and Judah. They shall live in safety in it, and shall build houses and plant vineyards. They shall live in safety when I execute judgments upon all their neighbors who have treated them with contempt. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God. So all of these consequences, the consequences first, of falling away from God, worshiping other idols, these false idols, and God essentially, saying, You have abandoned me, so I will abandon you. And or remove God's protection from them, I should say. God's never going to abandon God's people, but God is choosing to remove protection, allowing other nations to come and conquer them, namely Babylon. And so, part of this is saying that Jerusalem gets conquered, and other nations kind of detest Jerusalem for trying to go with Egypt, partner with Egypt, and get Egypt to protect them, going against the agreement that they had set up with Babylon. And anyways, all these other nations around are laughing at them, and the idea is that Babylon comes and defeats those nations as well too. So everybody becomes in some ways in the same boat, being humbled in this experience, and coming to an awareness of God is the hope. In Ezekiel chapter 29, another prophecy is made, this time against Egypt. Highlights include in verse 6, "Then all the inhabitants of Egypt shall know that I am the Lord, because you were a staff of reed in the house of Israel, and when they grasped you in their hand, you broke and tore all their shoulders. And when they leaned on you, you broke and made their legs unsteady." So the idea is that, as I mentioned previously, Jerusalem and Judah reach out to Egypt for protection, but God does not allow it. It references, what was mentioned there in the book of Jeremiah. We'll see it referenced here in Ezekiel 2. But King Zedekiah had forsaken the covenant of Babylon, and King Zedekiah of Judah sought help from Pharaoh in Egypt. When Nebuchadnezzar, or Nezra, however you want to say it, because it's slightly different in these, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, in some parts of it, just even Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadnezzar, Rezar of Babylon. He found out about this deception and sent his army to utterly destroy Jerusalem and nations around, including Egypt. So, in Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 12, "I will make the land of Egypt a desolation among desolated countries, and her cities shall be a desolation 40 years among cities that are laid waste. I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them among the countries." But Egypt, just like Jerusalem, will have fortunes come back, and they will return to their land after 40 years, 70 years for Jerusalem. And these, though they will be less renowned in the future than they were previously. In Ezekiel chapter 30, the last chapter for today, this feels kind of repetitive. It just restates that Egypt will be conquered. In verse 4, it says, "A sword shall come upon Egypt, and anguish shall be in Ethiopia. When the slain fall in Egypt, and its wealth is carried away, and its foundations are torn down. Ethiopia and Put and Lud and all Arabia and Libya, and the people of the allied land shall fall with them by the sword." Therefore, in verse 22, "Thus says the Lord God, I am against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and I will break his arm, both his strong arm and the one that was already broken, and I will make the sword fall from his hand." When we oppose God, stand in God's ways, there are consequences. Consequences mainly hurt us more than they hurt God. And especially the idea of God's protection being removed from us and our lives, it makes it hard that we have to suffer. And even more than just like the normal suffering that we have to do just by being alive, just by living and accepting that life is hard at times. Here in the Bible, it kind of claims that because of the greatness and the magnitude of their sin, that God just utterly removed protection for a time as Babylon came in and humbled the nation through the destruction. So may we be humble of heart. May we turn towards God and look to God for guidance and for shelter and refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. all of these things from Psalm 46 come to mind as well. Be still and know that I'm God. So may you be able to find God, hear God's message for you, and turn to God in everything that you do.